My name is Valerie, and at 32 years old, I have mastered the art of becoming invisible. To the outside world, and especially to my family, I am a struggling single mother who scrapes by doing freelance data entry. I drive a dented Honda and wear sweaters from thrift stores. It is a carefully crafted disguise. In reality, I am the silent founder of Onyx Medical Logistics, a company that discreetly moves transplant organs and emergency equipment across the state. My net worth is something my father, Julian, could not count even if he had a calculator. But tonight, none of that mattered. The dining room of my parents' estate in Buckhead was suffocatingly warm. The air smelled of expensive roast duck and the heavy perfume my mother, Bernice, bathed in. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier light, a chandelier I had anonymously paid to repair last month. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, trying to cut a piece of turkey for my daughter, Mia. We were trying to be small. We were trying not to ruin the aesthetic. My sister Isolde sat opposite us, scrolling through her phone. She was 29 and beautiful in that high-maintenance way that screams desperate for validation. Next to her was her husband, Preston. Preston is white, coming from the prestigious Sterling family, a lineage of old money that had supposedly been running Atlanta for generations. He swirled his wine glass, looking at me with that familiar mix of pity and disgust. Preston checked his Rolex, a watch I knew was a high-quality replica, and cleared his throat loudly. The sound cut through the room like a knife. "Julian, Bernice," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I just got a text. My parents are 5 minutes away. The Sterlings are making good time, my father." Julian practically jumped out of his chair. He began straightening his tie, frantically checking his reflection in the silverware. He was a black man who had spent his entire life trying to prove he belonged in these circles, and the approval of the Sterling family was his drug of choice. "That is wonderful, Preston," my father said, breathless. "Bernice, check the roast. Make sure the napkins are folded the way his mother likes." Preston did not move. He just kept staring at me and Mia. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "There is just one small problem, Julian," Preston said, pointing a manicured finger at me. "My parents are traditional people. They are accustomed to a certain level of excellence. Having Valerie here with her situation might make things uncomfortable." I put down my fork. "My situation?" I asked quietly. "You know what I mean, Val," Preston smirked. "No husband, no career. Look at your daughter's dress. It is from a discount rack, isn't it?" "My mother has a very sensitive constitution. She gets depressed when she sees poverty. It ruins her appetite." Isolde let out a short, cruel laugh. "He is right, Daddy. We cannot have the Sterlings sitting next to someone who looks like she just got off a shift at a diner. It ruins the vibe." My mother, Bernice, rushed over, wiping her hands on a silk cloth. She did not look at me. She looked at the table setting, ensuring no dust was visible. "Preston is right, Julian," my mother said. "We have worked too hard to get the Sterlings to come to our house for Christmas. We cannot risk embarrassing Preston." My father turned to me. His eyes were cold. There was no warmth, no fatherly affection, just calculation. "Valerie, take Mia and go to the garage," he said. "Excuse me?" I asked, thinking I had misheard. "The garage," my father repeated. "Or the basement. Just get out of the main house. You can wait there until the Sterlings leave. There is a heater in the storage room. It will not be that cold." I looked at Mia. She had stopped chewing. Her big brown eyes were wide with confusion. "Daddy, you want me to put your granddaughter in a storage room on Christmas Eve so your son-in-law's parents do not have to look at us?" I asked, my voice steady. Do not be dramatic, Valerie, Preston interjected. It is just for a few hours. Think of it as knowing your place. You are lucky they even let you eat the appetizers. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the floor. No, I said. We are not going to the garage. We are finishing our dinner, and then we are leaving. I sat back down and reached for a bread roll for Mia. That was the moment the atmosphere shifted from tense to dangerous. My mother, Bernice, walked over to us. Her face was twisted in anger. She reached out and snatched the porcelain plate right out from under my daughter's hands. The fork clattered onto the expensive tablecloth. You will not disrespect us in our own house, my mother hissed, clutching the plate to her chest like a weapon. This food is for family, for people who contribute, for people who make us look good. You are nothing but a burden, Valerie. Mia started to cry silently, tears rolling down her cheeks. Get out, my father roared, pointing to the front door. Get out now, before the Sterlings pull into the driveway. I will not let you ruin my chance to bond with a real family. I stood up again, slowly. I picked up Mia, who was trembling. I did not scream. I did not beg. I looked at Preston, who was pouring himself another glass of my wine. I looked at Isolde, who was fixing her lipstick. If I walk out that door, Julian, I said, using his first name for the first time, I am never coming back. And everything I bring to this table leaves with me. My father laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. You bring nothing, he spat. You are a stain on this family's reputation. Go. And do not come back until you find a decent husband who can elevate us instead of dragging us down into the gutter with you. He marched to the front door and threw it open. A gust of freezing wind and snow blew into the hallway. He grabbed my coat from the rack and threw it onto the wet porch. Out, he commanded. I wrapped my arms around Mia, shielding her from the wind, and walked past him. I stepped out into the biting cold. Behind me, I heard Preston chuckle. Finally, Preston said, Now we can have a civilized dinner. My father looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with contempt, and slammed the heavy oak door shut. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. Click. I stood there for a moment, shivering in the snow, staring at the closed door. Inside, the golden light of the chandelier glowed warmly. I could see their silhouettes moving back to the table, laughing, toasting. They thought they had just taken out the trash. They had no idea they had just evicted their landlord, their banker, and their savior. I took Mia his hand and led her toward my beat-up Honda parked in the shadows. Where are we going, Mommy? Mia asked, her voice shaking. Grandma said we cannot eat. I opened the car door and buckled her in, turning on the heat immediately. I pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered over the contact for the general manager of the St. Regis Hotel. We are going home, baby, I whispered. Not the one we sleep in, the real one. And then Mommy is going to make a phone call that will turn their lights off. I looked back at the mansion one last time. Enjoy the darkness, Julian. It is going to be a long winter. The transition from the scented warmth of my parents' foyer to the biting Atlanta wind felt like a physical slap across the face. The heavy oak door did not just close behind us, it loomed over us like a judge delivering a final verdict. I tightened my grip on Mia's small hand, feeling her tremble through her mittens. She was shaking, not just from the temperature, but from the shock of having her grandmother snatch a plate of food away from her hungry mouth. I turned back for 1 second, a mistake I immediately regretted. Through the frosted glass of the French doors, I saw them. It was a tableau of cruelty I will never forget. Preston stood there with his hands in his pockets, rocking back on his heels. He raised his wine glass, my wine, from my private reserve in a mock toast. His lips moved. I could not hear the words through the thick glass, but I knew the shape of them. Good riddance. He looked like a man who had just taken out the trash, satisfied and smug, unaware that he had just thrown away the deed to his own life. Beside him, my sister, Isolde, did not even look at us with her own eyes. She looked at us through the lens of her iPhone. The flash went off, blinding me for a split second in the darkness. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was curating her perfect Christmas narrative. Later, I would see the caption on her story, "Finally getting rid of the toxic energy. New year, new vibes." She was using her own sister is homelessness as content to boost her engagement. She smiled at her screen, tapping the post button, oblivious to the fact that the phone service she was using was paid for by a family plan bill that drafted directly from my bank account. Then came the sound. It was distinct. The metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place. It was loud. It was final. It was the sound of a bridge being burned with gasoline and a match. My father, Julian, had not just closed the door. He had locked it, to ensure we could not even stand in the foyer to stay warm while we waited for the valet. He wanted us out in the elements. "Mommy, why doesn't Grandma want us?" Mia, his voice was so small, lost in the wind. I knelt down in the snow, ruining my pantyhose, not caring about the wet slush soaking into my knees. I pulled her puffy pink coat tighter around her chin. I looked her in the eyes, refusing to let her see a single tear fall from mine. "Because we do not belong in that house, baby," I told her, my voice steady as steel. "That house is for people who pretend. We are real. And very soon, they're going to realize that pretending does not pay the electric bill." We walked down the long, winding driveway lined with manicured hedges. The snow crunched under my boots. My Honda Civic sat at the curb looking pathetic next to the lineup of Mercedes and Porsches in the driveway. It was the car I used to maintain my cover, a symbol of the poverty they thought I lived in. But as I opened the door and buckled Mia into her booster seat, I felt a strange sensation wash over me. It was not sadness. It was clarity. The heat blasted from the vents, smelling faintly of dust and old coffee. It was the best smell in the world, because it smelled like freedom. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the dark windows of the mansion one last time. They thought they had locked me out. In reality, they had just locked themselves in a cage with a ticking time bomb. And as I put the car into gear, I knew exactly when the explosion would happen. Tomorrow morning, when the leasing office opens. The silence inside my rusted Honda Civic was broken only by the sound of Mia sobbing. It was a jagged, gut-wrenching sound that tore through the chest of my sweater and settled deep in my bones. My 7-year-old daughter huddled in the passenger seat, still clutching the hem of her thrift store dress, her tears soaking into the worn fabric of the seatbelt. The heater rattled as it struggled to push warm air into the cabin, a stark contrast to the silent, efficient climate control of the mansion we had just been expelled from. I reached over and brushed a damp curl away from her forehead. Her skin was ice cold from the walk down the driveway. "Mommy, why are we bad?" Mia asked, her voice trembling so hard the words barely formed. "Grandma looked at me like I was dirt. Did I eat too loud? Is that why they hate us?" That question broke something inside me, but it did not break me into pieces. It broke me open, revealing the steel that had been hiding underneath my passive exterior for years. I pulled the car over to the shoulder of the road, just out of sight of the mansion's gates. I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned to face her. "Look at me, Mia." She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "We are not bad," I said, my voice low and fierce. "And we are not poor. We were just pretending to be small so they would feel big. We were protecting them from the truth because I thought that is what family did. But the game is over now. Do you understand? We are done hiding." I pulled my phone from my purse. It was not the cracked screen burner phone I used around my parents to maintain the illusion of my poverty. It was my encrypted business line, a device that controlled assets worth more than my father's entire life savings. I dialed a number I had not used in months. It rang once before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Ms. Wilson, we did not expect to hear from you tonight. Is everything all right?" I stared at the dashboard light flickering on my beat-up Honda. The check engine light was on. It seemed poetic. "Activate the residence at the St. Regis," I commanded, my voice dropping an octave into the tone I used for boardroom negotiations. "I want the heat on 72 degrees. Stock the fridge with the organic strawberries Mia likes, and have a hot pizza waiting. Pepperoni, thin crust. We are coming in hot." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Understood, Miss Wilson. Anything else?" "Yes," I said, watching the snow fall on the windshield. "Initiate Protocol Clean Slate immediately." Protocol Clean Slate was a nuclear option I had designed years ago, but hoped never to use. It was a command to my financial team to sever every invisible thread connecting my wealth to my family's lifestyle. "Freeze the leasing accounts on the Bentley and the Range Rover," I instructed. "Flag the black card ending in 459 as stolen. Cancel the insurance policies on the estate. If they want to treat us like strangers, let us see how they survive without a stranger's money backing their loans." "Consider it done," the assistant said. "ETA to the hotel. 20 minutes, I said. "And Sarah, have the valet clear the front spot. I do not want to wait." I hung up and put the car in gear. The engine sputtered a noise that usually made me anxious about repair costs. Tonight, it just sounded like a goodbye song to a life of submission I was leaving behind. I looked at Mia. She had stopped crying, listening to the change in my voice. She looked at me with a mixture of confusion and awe. "Where are we going, Mommy?" she whispered. "The motel." I smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a genuine smile. It reached my eyes. "No, baby, not the motel. We are going to a place where nobody sends us to the garage. We are going to the top floor." I hit the gas and drove past the Motel 6 where my family assumed I would be taking my daughter. I did not even tap the brakes. We sped toward the glowing skyline of Atlanta, toward the St. Regis, where the doormen knew my name, and where the only thing cold would be the champagne waiting for me on ice. Back inside the Fortress of Lies, the atmosphere shifted the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. My father, Julian, and mother, Bernice, did not waste a second mourning the daughter they had just exiled into the snow. Instead, they scrambled like panicked stagehands preparing for the opening night of a Broadway play. Julian straightened the silk tie that I had bought him for Father Day 3 years ago, while Bernice frantically fluffed the pillows on the sofa pillows that I had selected from a boutique in Milan during a business trip. The house had to look perfect, because the judges were arriving and my family was terrified of the verdict. The headlights of a sleek black town car swept across the front windows, illuminating the frantic desperation on my parents' faces. The Sterlings were here. Winston and Eleanor Sterling walked in, carrying an air of judgment so thick it nearly choked the room. Winston was a man who spoke in low tones that demanded absolute silence, while Eleanor looked at the world as if she smelled something faintly unpleasant. They were the definition of old money, or at least that is what they wanted everyone to believe. Preston immediately went into performance mode. He greeted his parents with a kiss on the cheek and led them to the living room with the swagger of a man who owned everything he touched. "Let me pour you a drink," Father Preston said, reaching for the bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon sitting on the mantelpiece. "This is a vintage I have been saving for a special occasion. I had it imported directly from a vineyard in Bordeaux. It has notes of oak and blackberry that I knew you would appreciate." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly it was almost impressive. That bottle was from my private collection, stored in the climate-controlled cellar I paid to install in the basement. It cost more than Preston made in 3 months of his Ponzi scheme frauds. Preston would not know a vintage Bordeaux from a box of grape juice if it did not have a price tag on it, but Winston nodded approvingly, taking the glass. Eleanor Sterling ran a gloved hand over the velvet armchair, inspecting it for dust. "Exquisite taste," she murmured, looking at my mother. "I see you finally updated the interior, Bernice. The last time we were here it looked a bit dated. This feels much more sophisticated." Bernice beamed, clutching her pearls, her chest puffing out with pride. "Oh, thank you, Eleanor. I wanted something timeless. It took me months to find the right fabrics. I felt that the room needed to reflect our station in life." Another lie. I had hired the interior designer. I had signed the checks. I had chosen the palette. My mother had actually complained that the gray was too depressing, until she saw the invoice and realized how expensive it was. Now she wore my taste like a costume. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. Winston Sterling took a sip of the wine, but he did not look at Preston. He looked toward the window, his eyes narrowing as he stared out into the dark driveway. "As we drove up, I saw a rusted little Honda pulling out of your gates," Winston said, his voice cutting through the pleasantries like a razor. "It was making a terrible rattling noise. I certainly hope you are not letting guests park such eyesores in front of the main entrance. It really clashes with the aesthetic of the neighborhood." The room went deadly silent. I could imagine the sweat forming on Julian's upper lip. He laughed nervously, rubbing his palms together. "Oh, that," he stammered. "No, absolutely not, Winston. We would never invite someone who drives a car like that. That was just the help. A former maid. We had to let her go tonight, right before dinner." Preston chimed in, smiling cruelly. "Yes, she was stealing leftovers from the kitchen. Can you believe the audacity? We had to kick her out to protect the silver." Just the help. That is what I was to them. The bank account, the fixer, the maid. They stripped me of my name and my bloodline in seconds, just to impress 2 people who were drinking my wine. "Good decision," Winston said. "You cannot have people like that around. They drag everything down." Preston raised his glass. "To standards," he said. "To keeping the circle tight." They clinked their crystal glasses, drinking my wine, sitting on my furniture, in my house, celebrating the fact that they had finally erased me. They had no idea that the maid they just fired was the only reason the lights were still on. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the penthouse suite at the St. Regis, and for the first time that night, my daughter Mia stopped crying. Her mouth dropped open in a perfect little O of wonder. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, glittering like a jewelry box against the dark winter sky. In the center of the living room stood a 12-foot noble fir tree. It was not decorated with the tacky red and green tinsel my mother favored. This tree was draped in crystals and white silk ribbons, a professional installation I had commissioned for the company executives that cost more than my father's entire luxury SUV. Room service had arrived 3 minutes after we walked in. On the marble coffee table sat a large silver tray. The smell of truffle oil and melted cheese filled the air. It was a 24-karat gold leaf pizza, the hotel's signature dish for their VIP guests. "Go ahead, baby," I said, taking off her wet coat. "It is all for you." Mia climbed onto the velvet sofa, her thrift store dress looking starkly out of place against the luxury surroundings. She picked up a slice of pizza, the edible gold flakes shimmering under the chandelier light, and took a bite. A smile finally broke across her face, replacing the fear that had been there since my mother snatched her dinner away. "Mommy, this tastes like magic," she giggled. "It is magic," I whispered. "It is the magic of owning your own life." I sat in the armchair opposite her and pulled out my phone. The screen was still dark, silent. I knew exactly what was happening back at the mansion. They were clinking glasses, eating roast duck, and laughing about how they had successfully removed the stain from their perfect picture. They thought I was crying in a Motel 6. They thought I was ashamed. I opened the camera app. "Smile for mommy, baby," I said. Mia grinned, holding up the gold-flaked pizza slice with the massive $50,000 Christmas tree and the entire city of Atlanta glowing behind her. Click. The photo was a masterpiece. It captured the innocence of my daughter and the undeniable, obscene wealth of our surroundings. It was a visual contradiction that would shatter my family's narrative instantly. I opened Instagram. My account was private, usually reserved for a few close friends, but I knew my sister Isolde followed me just to mock my lifestyle, and I knew she had her notifications on. I typed the caption slowly, my fingers trembling, not from cold, but from adrenaline. "Kicked out of the family home for lacking class. Fortunately, my backup storage unit has a decent view and better pizza. Merry Christmas to everyone, except the people who let a 7-year-old freeze." Then came the final nail in the coffin. I tapped the location tag. I did not tag the St. Regis Hotel general location. I selected the custom geotag that only appeared for authorized devices. Onyx Holdings, Corporate Residence, Penthouse A. Onyx Holdings. The mysterious company that owned the lease on Preston Represents car. The company that held the mortgage my father was secretly late on. The company that had just bought the controlling stake in the brand Isolde represented. I took a deep breath. For 32 years, I had been the daughter who apologized. I had been the daughter who made herself small so they could feel big. Tonight, I was the daughter who pressed the button. Post. The blue bar slid across the top of the screen. Sent. I put the phone down on the marble table face up. I picked up a glass of sparkling cider and clinked it against Mia's juice box. "Cheers, baby," I said. "Cheers, Mommy." We took a sip. And then, 5 seconds later, the phone screen lit up. A notification. Then another. Then a text message. The silence was over. The war had begun. Back at the mansion, the air was thick with the smell of expensive roast duck and desperation. My parents were performing the performance of their lives, trying to convince Winston and Eleanor Sterling that they belonged at the top of the food chain. My father, Julian, was laughing too hard at Winston's dry jokes, while my mother, Bernice, was nervously rearranging the silverware whenever there was a lull in the conversation. They thought they were safe. They thought that by locking me out, they had secured their social standing. But they forgot that in the modern world, walls do not keep secrets. They just amplify the signal. The first crack in their perfect facade came in the form of a soft digital chime. It came from my sister Isolda's phone, which sat face up on the tablecloth next to her wine glass. She frowned, annoyed that the world was interrupting her moment of glory. She tapped the screen, expecting to see a compliment on her story about cutting off toxic family members. Instead, her eyebrows shot up. Then another notification came through, and another. Within seconds, her phone was lighting up like a slot machine hitting the jackpot. "What is it, Isolda?" my mother hissed through a fake smile, kicking her under the table. "Put that away, we have guests." Isolda did not put it away. She picked it up, her hand trembling slightly. Her face went pale, the color draining from her perfectly contoured cheeks. She looked at Preston, who was busy swirling his wine and trying to look sophisticated. "Preston," she whispered, her voice tight. "You need to see this." Preston waved her off. "Not now, babe. I was just telling Father about the new investment portfolio I am managing." But Winston Sterling was not listening to his son. The patriarch of the Sterling family had pulled out his own phone. He was a man who watched the markets and the social currents of Atlanta with hawk eyes. He had received an alert, not from a gossip site, but from a business associate who followed the real power players in the city. Winston stopped chewing. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and leaned in closer to the screen, squinting as if he could not believe what he was seeing. The room went deadly quiet. The only sound was the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting down the seconds until my father's humiliation. Julian Winston said, his voice deep and rumbling like thunder. "I thought you said that woman, the one who left in the rattling Honda, was your former maid." My father wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with a linen napkin. He laughed nervously, a high-pitched sound that betrayed his fear. "She is, Winston. Just some help we had to let go. She had sticky fingers, if you know what I mean. We are better off without her." Winston slowly turned his phone around, facing the table. The screen was bright in the dim room. There was the photo of my daughter Mia eating gold leaf pizza. But more importantly, there was the background. The undeniable panoramic view from the top of the St. Regis and the geotag that read, "Onyx Holdings Corporate Residence." "Then why?" Winston asked, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Is your maid sitting in the private penthouse reserved for the chairman of Onyx Holdings?" Preston choked on his wine, coughing violently into his napkin. My mother froze her fork, hovering halfway to her mouth. "I have been trying to get a meeting with the Onyx board for 6 months," Winston continued, his eyes locking onto my father. "That penthouse is not bookable, Julian. You cannot rent it on Expedia. You have to own the building to get that key. Are you telling me your maid has connections that exceed my own?" My father looked at the photo. He stared at the daughter he had called a failure, the daughter he had thrown into the snow, sitting on a velvet throne that he could never afford in 10 lifetimes. He opened his mouth to lie, to spin a story to save face, but nothing came out. For the first time all night, the truth was staring him in the face. And it was wearing a thrift store dress and eating pizza worth more than his dignity. The dinner was no longer a celebration. It was an interrogation, and my family did not have the answers. The morning of December 26th dawned crisp and bright over the Buckhead estate. The air was still cold from the snowstorm the night before, but inside the mansion the mood was frantic. My family was preparing for a day of golf at the country club, a performance designed to convince the Sterling family that their financial standing was as solid as the marble columns on the front porch. From the comfort of my hotel suite, miles away, I watched the GPS tracker on my laptop screen blink. The target was stationary. I took a sip of my coffee and whispered one word: freeze. Preston marched out of the front door wearing a white polo shirt that was so bright it hurt to look at. He carried a set of custom golf clubs over his shoulder, whistling a tune without a care in the world. He was the picture of arrogant confidence. Behind him, his parents, Winston and Eleanor Sterling, walked slowly, inspecting the landscaping with critical eyes. "Let me drive us," Father Preston called out, unlocking the black Range Rover with the key fob. "This beauty rides smoother than your town car. I just had it detailed." Winston nodded, adjusting his cap. "I must admit, Preston, you have done well for yourself. This is a $100,000 vehicle. It shows stability." Preston beamed, soaking in the validation he craved so desperately. He tossed the clubs into the trunk and slid into the driver's seat. He smelled the leather interior, inhaling the scent of the luxury he felt he deserved. He placed his foot on the brake and pressed the start button, expecting the engine to roar to life with its signature aggressive growl. Click. Silence. Preston frowned. He pressed the button again, harder this time. Click. Silence. Outside the car, Winston and Eleanor stood waiting by the driveway, their breath visible in the cold air. Winston checked his watch. Preston felt a bead of sweat form on his forehead, despite the freezing temperature. "Come on," he muttered. "Do not do this to me now." Suddenly, the dashboard came alive. But it was not the usual welcome animation. The entire digital instrument cluster turned a bright, angry red. The infotainment screen in the center console flashed with a lock symbol. A robotic voice, cool and indifferent, filled the cabin. Authorization denied. Lease agreement terminated by lessor. Asset secured. Preston frantically jabbed at the screen, trying to make the message disappear. But the text remained bold and unyielding. Property of Onyx Leasing, repossession imminent. Winston tapped on the driver's side window. Preston jumped. He rolled down the window, his smile looking more like a grimace of pain. "Is there a problem, son?" Winston asked. "We are going to be late for our tea time." "It is just a glitch," Preston stammered, his voice cracking. "These modern computers are so sensitive. I think the battery might be cold. It just needs a minute to reset." "I paid the lease off months ago, so it is definitely a mistake." Winston leaned in closer, peering past Preston at the glowing red screen. He was a businessman who had survived 3 recessions. He knew what financial failure looked like. He read the text aloud, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. Asset secured. Repossession imminent. Preston tried to cover the screen with his hand. "Dad, it is a software error. I will call the dealership." Winston stepped back from the car, as if it were contagious. He looked at his son with a mixture of suspicion and disappointment that cut deeper than any shout. "Software errors do not accuse you of non-payment," Preston Winston said coldly. "And why is the lessor listed as Onyx Leasing? I thought you said you bought this car outright with your bonus check." Preston opened his mouth, but no lies came out. The car sat there, a 2-ton paperweight of humiliation, dead in the driveway. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Eleanor Sterling sighing loudly. "Call an Uber, Winston," she said, not even looking at her son. "I told you something smelled rotten in this house, and it is not the drains." The air inside the Buckhead Sanctuary Spa smelled of eucalyptus and old money. My mother, Bernice, lay on a heated massage table next to Eleanor Sterling, soaking in the steam. They had just finished the Golden Glow facial, a 3-hour treatment involving 24-karat gold masks that cost more than most families spend on groceries in a month. Bernice was glowing, not just from the expensive oils, but from the satisfaction of finally being accepted into Eleanor's inner circle. She had spent decades trying to get an invite to this specific spa day, and now she felt like she had finally arrived. She wrapped her plush white robe tighter around her waist as they walked to the front desk. Bernice made sure to walk slightly ahead of Eleanor, eager to display her generosity. "It is so important to take time for ourselves, isn't it, Eleanor?" Bernice chirped, her voice high and unnatural. "Julian always insists I treat myself. He says I work too hard managing the estate, so he gave me his black card to use today." It was a lie, of course. Julian spent his days watching golf reruns while I paid the bills, but Bernice had repeated the lie so many times she actually believed it. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect skin and a fake smile, turned the iPad around. "For both ladies today, the total comes to $3,200, including gratuity." Bernice waved her hand dismissively, laughing as if the amount was pennies. "Put it all on my card, darling. It is the least I can do." She reached into her Louis Vuitton bag and pulled out the heavy, matte black American Express card. It was the ultimate status symbol, the kind of card that usually made cashiers nervous. She handed it over with a flourish, enjoying the way the light caught the titanium surface. The receptionist inserted the chip. We waited. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then a sharp, harsh beep cut through the Zen music. The receptionist frowned. "I am sorry, Mrs. Wilson. It says declined." Bernice laughed, a nervous, brittle sound that echoed in the quiet lobby. "Do not be silly. Run it again. The chip is probably dirty or your machine is having a bad day. There is no limit on that card." The girl ran it again. Beep. Silence. Eleanor Sterling shifted her weight, looking at her diamond-encrusted watch. "Is there a problem, Bernice? We have a lunch reservation at 1. The receptionist looked at the screen, her polite mask slipping just a fraction. "It is not the chip, ma'am. The system is giving a specific error code. It says the authorized user account has been frozen by the primary account holder." Bernice froze. "I am the primary holder," she lied, her voice trembling. The receptionist shook her head slowly. "No, ma'am. The name on the master account is Valerie Wilson. She put a block on this card at 9 this morning, reporting it as lost or stolen by a third party." The name hung in the air like a bad smell. Valerie. The daughter Bernice had kicked out into the snow less than 24 hours ago. The daughter she claimed was a thief. The daughter she told everyone was a failure. Eleanor Sterling let out a long, slow sigh. It was a sound of pure pity mixed with disgust. She stepped forward, pushing Bernice gently aside as if she were a piece of furniture that was in the way. "Oh, dear," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with ice. "I suppose the maid controls the finances, too. How embarrassing for you." Eleanor pulled out her own card, a platinum one that actually belonged to the Sterling Family Trust. "Take mine," she told the girl. "I cannot stand around here all day while Mrs. Wilson sorts out her domestic issues." As the transaction went through, Bernice stood there clutching her useless black card, her face burning a deep shade of crimson. She had brought Eleanor here to show off her wealth, but instead she had just revealed that she was nothing more than a pauper wrapped in borrowed silk. She looked at the card in her hand, and for the first time she realized that the plastic rectangle was not a symbol of her power. It was a leash. And I had just let go of the handle. The silence in the penthouse suite was absolute and luxurious. I sat on the velvet sofa wrapped in a cashmere robe, watching the morning sun reflect off the glass skyscrapers of Atlanta. In my hand, I held a mug of Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee, black, no sugar. It was the most expensive coffee in the world, a small indulgence I allowed myself now that I was no longer funneling 80% of my income into maintaining my parents' facade of wealth. Then the peace was shattered. My phone vibrating on the marble coffee table sounded like an angry hornet. The screen lit up with a photo I had set years ago. It was a picture of my father, Julian, looking stern and judgmental. I did not pick it up immediately. I took another slow sip of coffee, letting the rich flavor coat my tongue. I let it ring 4 times, 5 times. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted him to feel the lack of access. Finally, I tapped the green icon and pressed the speaker button. I did not say hello. I did not have to. "Have you lost your damn mind, girl?" My father's voice filled the room, distorted by rage and static. He was screaming so loud, the microphone on his end was clipping. "Do you have any idea what you just did to your mother?" he roared. "She called me in tears, Valerie. Tears. She is stuck at the spa front desk while Eleanor Sterling pays her bill like she is a charity case. And Preston, my God, Preston is stranded in the driveway because his car thinks it is being stolen. Fix this. Fix this right now, or so help me God." I placed the phone back on the table and leaned back, crossing my legs. I looked at the ceiling, calmly counting the crystals in the chandelier. "Good morning to you too, Julian," I said, my voice smooth and unbothered. "I assume you are calling because you received the notifications." "I am calling because you are embarrassing this family," he shouted. "You are humiliating us in front of the Sterlings. Unfreeze the cards, Valerie. Unlock the car. Stop this childish tantrum immediately." I took another sip of coffee. The warmth spread through my chest, a stark contrast to the coldness in my father's voice. "I am confused," I said. "You were very clear last night. You stood at the door in your custom tuxedo, and you told me explicitly that I was no longer family. You said I was a stain. You told me to leave and never come back until I found someone to elevate me." "That was discipline," my father sputtered. "That was tough love. I did not mean you should cut off the money. You owe us, Valerie. We raised you. We put a roof over your head, and I paid for that roof 10 times over." I interrupted, my voice hardening. "I paid for the roof, the cars, the insurance, and the reputation you are so desperate to protect. But here's the thing about family, Julian. If I am not family enough to sit at your table, then I am certainly not family enough to pay your bills." There was a silence on the other end. A heavy, stunned silence. He had never heard me speak like this. He was used to the Valerie who apologized, the Valerie who begged for crumbs of affection. "You cannot do this," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "You are ungrateful." "No," I said. "I am just a stranger. And strangers do not lend their black cards to people who treat them like garbage. I am reclaiming my assets, all of them. The car is being towed in an hour. The cards are canceled. Consider this my resignation from your drama." "Valerie, wait! Do not! You dare hang up on me. I command you to." I tapped the red button, ending the call mid-sentence. The room returned to its beautiful, expensive silence. I looked at the black screen and smiled. For the first time in my life, I did not feel guilty. I felt light. I finished my coffee and stood up. It was time to get dressed. I had a meeting with a lawyer, and my family had a date with reality. The silence inside the mansion was heavy and suffocating. While Julian and Bernice were upstairs arguing about who was to blame for the morning humiliation, Preston slipped into his father-in-law's home office. He needed answers. He needed to know why his life was collapsing. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind him, and he turned the lock. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper, the scent of a man who was trying desperately to look like a tycoon while drowning in debt. Preston walked to the large oak desk. It was covered in stacks of unopened envelopes. Julian was the type of man who believed that if you did not open a bill, it did not exist. Preston shoved aside a pile of past due notices from the country club and began rummaging through the drawers. He was looking for the vehicle registration for the Range Rover. He needed to prove that the red warning screen was just a computer glitch. He found the file labeled Vehicles, buried under a stack of golf magazines. He flipped it open, his hands shaking slightly. There it was, the lease agreement for the Range Rover. He scanned the document looking for his name. He expected to see Preston Sterling listed as the lessee. Instead, the name in the box was Onyx Leasing LLC. And in the line for the guarantor, the person financially responsible for the asset, the name was typed in crisp black ink. Valerie Wilson. Preston blinked. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. Valerie. The sister-in-law he had mocked for wearing discount shoes. The woman he had just kicked out into the snow. It has to be a mistake, he muttered to himself, his voice sounding thin in the quiet room. She drives a Honda. She cannot afford the tires on this truck, let alone the lease. He kept digging. He pulled out the file marked mortgage. He knew Julian had been struggling with the house payments for years, but he assumed the old man had refinanced. He pulled out the most recent statement. It was not from a bank. The letterhead read, Onyx Asset Management. The document stated clearly that the mortgage note had been purchased from the original lender 6 months ago. The status of the loan was current only because of monthly transfers from an account named the Mia Wilson Trust. Preston felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. The room suddenly felt very small. He grabbed the file for the life insurance policies. Bernice had always bragged about their multi-million-dollar policies. He looked at the payment history. Paid in full. Payer, Valerie Wilson. He dropped the papers onto the desk. They scattered like autumn leaves. Everywhere he looked, he saw her name. The electricity bill, the landscaping service, the water bill. Even the subscription for the wine club Preston loved so much. Valerie, Valerie, Valerie. He backed away from the desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was impossible. Valerie was a nobody. She was a single mother who clipped coupons. There was no way she was the one bankrolling their entire existence. Then a thought crept into his mind. A twisted, dark rationalization that allowed him to keep his ego intact. He let out a short, breathless laugh. She is a front, he whispered. That is it. She is not a CEO. She is sleeping with one. He paced around the room, nodding to himself, constructing a new reality that made sense to him. She is probably the mistress of some old billionaire who runs this Onyx company, he thought. He puts assets in her name to hide them from his wife. She is just a signature. She is just a sugar baby washing money for some criminal. He stopped pacing and looked at the papers again. The fear in his chest began to transform into anger. He felt deceived. Not because he had been living on charity, but because he believed she had tricked them. "You think you are smart, Valerie," he hissed at the empty room. "You think you can hold this over us? But I know what you are. Now, you are just a high-priced escort with a checkbook." He grabbed his phone. He did not feel shame anymore. He felt a surge of malicious confidence. He was going to expose her. He was going to go to that hotel and force her to admit that she was nothing more than a fraud. He unlocked the door and stepped back out into the hallway, leaving the evidence of his own incompetence scattered across the desk. He had no idea that by walking out that door, he was walking straight into a legal wood chipper. The lobby of the St. Regis is designed to make the outside world feel very far away. It is a sanctuary of marble floors, fresh orchids, and hushed conversations about seven-figure deals. I was sitting in a high-backed velvet wing chair near the fireplace, reviewing a merger contract on my tablet. I looked like exactly what I was, a businesswoman closing a deal. But to the man storming through the revolving doors, I was still just a target. Preston marched into the lobby, bringing a cloud of chaotic energy with him. He looked unraveled. His expensive polo shirt was stained with sweat under the arms, and his hair, usually gelled to perfection, was disheveled. He scanned the room wildly until his eyes locked on me. He did not see the security detail standing discreetly by the pillars. He only saw his victim. He stomped across the Persian rug, ignoring the concierge who tried to intercept him. He stopped right in front of my table, blocking the light from the fireplace. "Valerie!" he barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Stop this insanity right now!" I did not look up from my screen. I swiped to the next page of the contract. "Hello, Preston," I said, calm as the surface of a frozen lake. "You seem upset." "Upset?" he laughed, a manic sound that made the couple at the next table look over in alarm. "You stole my car, you cut off your mother's cards, you are having a mental breakdown, Valerie." "I talked to Julian and we agree. You are clearly unstable. You are jealous of Isolde, and you are lashing out because you are lonely and bitter." He was doing what he did best, gaslighting, trying to rewrite reality so that I was the crazy one and he was the rational victim. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and slammed it onto the table next to my tea. "Sign this," he commanded. "It is a letter to the bank, authorizing the release of all assets and admitting that the freeze was a system error caused by your incompetence. Sign it, and I will convince your father not to press charges against you for theft. I am doing you a favor here, Val." I finally looked up. I took off my reading glasses and looked him in the eye. I saw the fear behind his arrogance. He was terrified. "I am not signing anything, Preston," I said softly. "And I think you should leave before you embarrass yourself further." His face turned a dangerous shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged. He was not used to being told no, especially not by me. He lunged forward, reaching out to grab my wrist. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little," he started to scream. He never finished the sentence. Before his fingertips could even graze the sleeve of my silk blouse, a hand the size of a dinner plate clamped onto his shoulder. It was Marcus, the head of my private security detail. Marcus was 6'5" and built like a tank. He did not look like a hotel employee. He looked like a wall. Sir Marcus said, his voice deep and rumbling, "You need to step back. Now." Preston tried to shrug him off, but he might as well have been trying to shove a mountain. "Get your hands off me!" Preston shrieked, drawing the attention of the entire lobby. "Do you know who I am? I am a Sterling. I am family. She is my sister-in-law." I picked up my teacup and took a slow sip. "I do not know this man," I said to Marcus, not even looking at Preston anymore. "He is harassing me. Please remove him." Preston's jaw dropped. "Valerie, you cannot do this. I am family." Marcus tightened his grip. Preston yelped in pain. "Ms. Wilson has asked you to leave," Marcus said. 2 more security guards appeared from the shadows flanking Preston. They did not ask him nicely. They grabbed him by the arms, lifting him onto his toes. They marched him toward the door, his expensive loafers dragging across the marble floor. He was kicking and screaming, threats promising to ruin me, promising to sue everyone. But nobody was listening. They threw him out of the revolving doors and onto the sidewalk. Through the glass, I watched him stumble and fall onto his hands and knees. He looked back at me, his face twisted in hate. But I just turned back to my contract. He had come in like a lion, but he left like a stray dog kicked out of a restaurant kitchen. And the tea tasted sweeter than ever. The ring light reflected in my sister Isolde's eyes, making her look like a perfectly manufactured plastic doll. She sat at her vanity table in her bedroom, surrounded by piles of PR packages and expensive makeup. She was in her element. She was broadcasting live to her 50,000 followers, holding a bottle of luxury serum like it was a holy relic. She had spent the last 20 minutes spinning a sob story about how her Christmas was ruined by a toxic family member who caused a scene. She did not mention my name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. She painted herself as the saint, the peacemaker who was just trying to have a nice dinner. "So, guys, remember to protect your peace," she chirped, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Sometimes you just have to cut people off, even if you grew up with them. Negative energy blocks your blessings, and we are all about abundance in the new year." She smiled, tapping the bottle with her long manicured fingernails. "Speaking of blessings, I am so excited to announce that I have renewed my contract with Lumina Beauty as their lead brand ambassador. This campaign is going to pay for my entire summer in Europe." Just as the words left her mouth, a chime echoed through the room. It was the distinct sound of a priority email landing on her iPad, which was propped up next to the camera. Isolde glanced over, her smile widening. "Oh, look at that," she said to the camera. "Probably the official contract, right on time. Let us read it together, guys. Unboxing my future." She swiped the screen open. I was watching from my hotel room and I leaned forward. This was the moment. Her smile faltered, her brow furrowed. She squinted at the screen as if the words were written in a foreign language. "Dear Ms. Wilson," she read aloud, her voice wavering slightly. "We are writing to inform you that Lumina Beauty is terminating your brand ambassador agreement, effective immediately." The chat on her screen started moving faster. Comments like, "What is happening?" and "Is this a prank?" scrolled by. Isolde ignored them. She kept reading, her hands starting to shake. "Due to a recent acquisition, Lumina Beauty is now a subsidiary of Onyx Asset Management. The new board of directors has reviewed our influencer roster and determined that your personal brand does not align with our core values of integrity and authenticity. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." Isolde froze. She stared at the word Onyx. She had seen that word on Preston's locked car. She had seen that word on the geotag of my pizza photo. Onyx. "No," she whispered. "No, she cannot do this. This is not fair." She forgot she was live. She forgot the ring light. She stood up so fast her chair tipped over with a loud crash. "It is her!" she shrieked, her face twisting into an ugly mask of rage. "It is Valerie! She bought the company! She bought the whole damn company just to fire me!" Isolde grabbed the bottle of serum, the one she had just been praising, and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the wall, shattering into 1,000 glass shards and splattering expensive liquid all over her white carpet. "I hate her!" she screamed, grabbing handfuls of makeup brushes and sweeping them onto the floor. "She is ruining everything!" "Mom? Mom, come here!" She grabbed the iPad to throw it too, but realized too late that the camera was still rolling. 50,000 people had just watched the elegant, peaceful influencer turn into a screaming banshee. They had heard her admit that her sister had the power to buy a corporation just to silence her. She scrambled to end the stream, her fingers fumbling over the screen, but the damage was done. The screen went black, but the internet is forever. My sister had wanted to be famous. Now she was going to be viral, but not for the reasons she wanted. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. She had lost her contract, but she had just given me a front row seat to her destruction. The study smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive scotch that was rapidly running out. My father, Julian, sat in his oversized leather armchair looking 10 years older than he had that morning. He was staring blankly at the empty spot in the driveway where the Range Rover used to sit before the tow truck dragged it away. The humiliation was a physical weight in the room pressing down on his chest. Preston stood by the window, swirling his drink. He was sweating, but he masked it well. His mind was racing. The bookies had texted him 10 minutes ago, threatening to break his legs if he did not come up with $50,000 by midnight. He needed money, and he needed it now. He turned to my father, putting on the mask of the financial genius he pretended to be. "Julian, listen to me," Preston said, his voice smooth and confident. "I know today looks like a disaster. I know you are worried, but you have to trust me. This is actually a blessing in disguise." My father looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. "A blessing, Preston. My wife is crying in her bedroom because her credit card was declined in front of your mother." The Sterlings left without finishing their tea. We are the laughing stock of Atlanta. How is this a blessing? Preston walked over to the desk and leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "The reason my accounts are frozen is not because of Valerie." He lied, his eyes wide and earnest. "It is a security protocol. I am in the middle of a massive liquidity transfer, Project Phoenix. It is a cryptocurrency arbitrage deal involving the Asian markets. It is so big, the banks automatically flagged my accounts to prevent fraud." He paused, letting the buzzwords sink in. My father did not understand cryptocurrency, but he understood the word massive. He sat up a little straighter. "So you were not broke?" Julian asked, hope flickering in his eyes. "Broke?" Preston laughed, shaking his head. Julian, I am on the verge of making $10 million. The buy-in window closes tonight. That is the problem. My capital is tied up in the transfer until Monday, but if I do not put down the initial stake by midnight, I lose the deal." He slammed his hand on the desk for dramatic effect. "I just need a bridge loan," Preston said, urgency creeping into his voice. $500,000 just for a week. Once the deal clears on Friday, I will pay you back double, $1 million cash, tax-free. We can buy a better car than the Sterlings. We can buy the St. Regis and kick Valerie out ourselves." My father's eyes widened. Greed was a powerful drug, and Preston was the dealer. I do not have 500,000 liquid, Preston, Julian said, his voice trembling. You know that. Preston placed a reassuring hand on my father's shoulder. But you have this house, Julian. This magnificent estate. It is sitting on millions in equity, just gathering dust. I have a private lender ready to sign the paperwork today. No credit checks, just asset-backed. We sign today, we get the cash tonight, and we turn it into a fortune by the weekend. My father looked at the family portrait on the wall. He looked at the empty driveway. He hated feeling powerless. He hated feeling poor. The promise of $1 million was not just money to him. It was a way to regain his dignity. It was a weapon he could use to crush me. Double my money in a week, Julian asked, reaching for his gold fountain pen. Guaranteed, Preston lied without blinking. My father uncapped the pen. He did not read the documents Preston pulled from his jacket pocket. He did not ask for a prospectus. He simply signed his name on the line that put his entire life creates work at risk. He thought he was investing in an empire. He had no idea he was just paying off his son-in-law's gambling debts. Done, Julian said, handing the paper back. Go make us rich, son. Preston smiled. It was the smile of a wolf who had just convinced the sheep to open the gate. The only sound in the dim study was the ticking of the grandfather clock, a sound that felt like a countdown to a bomb detonation. My father, Julian, sat at his mahogany desk, his hand hovering over the document that would seal his fate. It was a second mortgage application, leveraging the entire equity of the estate. Every brick, every pillar, every square inch of the land he was so proud of was about to be put on the line. He looked up at Preston, who was leaning against the bookshelf, trying to look like a Wall Street titan instead of a desperate gambler. Preston checked his phone, pretending to monitor the Asian markets. We have 5 minutes, Julian, Preston said, checking his watch. The window for the Project Phoenix buy-in closes at noon. If we miss this, we miss the $10 million payout. Winston is putting in $2 million. Do you want to be left behind while my parents double their fortune? That was the trigger. The mention of Winston Sterling was the key that unlocked my father's insecurity. Julian hated feeling inferior. He hated the way Winston had looked at him the night before with pity in his eyes when the car did not start. He hated that his daughter Valerie had humiliated him. He wanted to win. He wanted to be the hero who saved the family and rubbed his success in everyone his face. But Bernice... Julian hesitated, his voice trembling. I should talk to her. This is her house too. If she finds out I mortgaged it without asking her... She will forgive you when you hand her a check for $1 million next week, Preston interrupted, his voice smooth as silk. Think about it, Julian. Do you want to ask for permission, or do you want to ask for forgiveness while you are booking a first-class trip to Paris? Be the man of the house. Take charge. Julian looked at the papers again. He saw the number $500,000. It was a terrifying amount. But then he looked at Preston, his golden boy son-in-law, the sterling heir. He desperately wanted to believe the lie. He unscrewed the cap of his Mont Blanc pen. The nib touched the paper. The scratch of the ink sounded loud in the quiet room. He signed his name, Julian Wilson. With that signature, he signed away his safety net, his retirement, and his wife as security. Here, Julian said, his hand shaking as he handed the document to Preston. Make us rich, son. Preston snatched the paper, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. He did not say thank you. He did not offer reassurance. He just nodded, shoved the papers into his briefcase, and walked out of the room. Julian slumped back in his chair, exhaling a long breath, thinking he had just made the investment of a lifetime. Outside in the hallway, Preston did not call a broker in Tokyo. He did not check the crypto markets. He pulled out his burner phone and dialed a number saved as the Shark. "I got it," Preston whispered into the phone, walking quickly toward his rental car. "The transfer is initiating now. 500 large. Tell the boss I am good for it. And tell those guys to stay away from my knees." He hung up and let out a laugh of pure relief. He was not investing a dime. Every cent of my father's equity was going straight into the pocket of an underground bookie to pay off a debt from betting on horses. My father thought he was buying a future. In reality, he had just bought his son-in-law another week of breathing room, and he had paid for it with the roof over his head. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a sea of silk gowns and flashing diamonds, a playground for the true elite of Atlanta. My parents, Julian and Bernice, walked in clutching the general admission tickets they had scraped together cash to buy at the last minute. They were used to sitting at table 5, right near the stage where the champagne flowed freely. Tonight, the usher looked at their crumpled tickets, frowned, and pointed toward the back of the room. They were seated at table 99, right next to the swinging double doors of the kitchen, where the smell of dish soap mixed with the expensive perfume of the guests they used to look down on. I watched them from the private VIP balcony. My mother, Bernice, adjusted her dress, a gown she had worn 3 years ago because her credit cards were frozen. She looked around nervously, hoping nobody noticed they were sitting in the exile zone. Preston was already loosening his tie, his face flushed with cheap liquor he had consumed in the parking lot since he could not afford the premium open bar upgrade. He looked small and angry, like a child forced to sit at the kids' table. Then the music changed. The house lights dimmed, and a spotlight hit the grand staircase. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Please welcome our diamond sponsor. The woman who made tonight's fundraising goal possible, the chairwoman of Onyx Asset Management, Ms. Valerie Wilson." The sound of my father dropping his fork onto his plate was audible even from where I stood. I walked down the stairs wearing a custom gown made of crushed velvet, the color of money. Flashbulbs erupted like a thunderstorm. The mayor of Atlanta was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps. Not with a polite handshake, but with a warm, familiar embrace. He took my hand and led me not to a table, but to the center dais, the seat of honor usually reserved for royalty. I saw my sister Isolde shrink in her seat, trying to hide behind a massive floral arrangement. She knew that every camera in the room was pointed at me, and she knew that for the first time in her life, she was utterly invisible. My father half stood up, a pathetic, hopeful smile on his face. He actually thought I was going to wave him over. He thought he could piggyback on my moment. The mayor leaned into the microphone. "I want to thank Valerie, not just for her donation of $2 million, but for being a pillar of integrity in our city." $2 million. My mother grasped her chest, gasping for air. That was the exact amount they needed to save their house. They watched me laugh at something the mayor said, my head thrown back in genuine joy. I was glowing. I walked past their table on my way to the podium. I slowed down just enough for them to see the diamonds around my neck. Real ones, not the paste replicas Bernice was wearing. My father opened his mouth to say my name. I looked right through him. I looked at the waiter standing behind him and spoke loud enough for them to hear. "Please bring table 99 a pitcher of tap water. They look dehydrated." Then I kept walking. The applause was deafening, but the stunned silence from my family's table was the sweetest sound of the night. They were in the same room, but we were in different universes. And for the first time, they were realizing that they were just spectators in my world. The men's restroom at the Ritz-Carlton was a sanctuary of black marble and gold fixtures, quiet enough to hear a pin drop or a heartbreak. My father, Julian, walked in feeling like a king. He had just mortgaged his home and handed over $500,000 to his son-in-law, believing he had bought a ticket to the billionaire club. He saw Winston Sterling standing at the sink washing his hands with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who owned the world. Julian adjusted his tie in the mirror, forcing a smile that was equal parts desperation and pride. He walked over to the adjacent sink, wanting to bond with the man he now considered his equal, his partner in wealth. "Great evening, isn't it, Winston?" Julian said, his voice echoing slightly off the tiled walls. "I must say, Preston is truly a visionary. That Project Phoenix deal is going to change everything for our families. I am glad I could come in on the ground floor with you. It feels good to keep the wealth in the circle, doesn't it?" Winston stopped washing his hands. He did not look at my father. He stared at his own reflection in the glass, his expression unreadable, cold, and distant. He reached for a linen towel and dried his fingers one by one, taking his time, letting my father's words hang in the air until they started to rot. "Project Phoenix." Winston repeated the name, tasting it like sour milk. "Is that what he is calling it this time? Last year it was the Cobalt Initiative. The year before that it was the Sovereign Fund." My father paused the soap on his hands, suddenly feeling sticky. "What do you mean, Winston?" he said. "You put in $2 million. He said we were doubling our capital by Friday." Winston finally turned his head. He looked at Julian, not with anger, but with the kind of pity you give a wounded animal before you put it out of its misery. The older man dropped the used towel into the wicker basket. "Julian Winston," said his voice low and devoid of emotion, "I have not given my son a single dime in 5 years. Not for business, not for rent, not for a cup of coffee. Preston is not a financial genius. Preston is a degenerate gambler with addiction that could swallow this entire hotel." The color drained from my father's face so fast it looked like his blood had evaporated. He gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles turning white. But Julian stammered, his voice shaking. "But the car, the lifestyle. He said he manages the family trust." Winston let out a short, humorless laugh. "There is no trust, Julian. He gambled his trust away before he turned 25. Why do you think he married your daughter? He needed a host. He needed a fresh supply of credit. And from what I saw today, with the car and the cards, it seems he bled your daughter Valerie dry, and now he has moved on to you." My father felt the room spin, the $500,000, the mortgage, the signature he had hidden from my mother. It was all gone. He had not invested in a dynasty. He had thrown his life savings into a black hole. "I gave him everything," Julian whispered. "I mortgaged the house." Winston buttoned his suit jacket, preparing to leave. "Then you are a fool," Winston said simply. "You just threw your money out the window and it is never coming back. Do not ask me for help, Julian. I cut that cancer out of my life years ago. I suggest you do the same." Winston walked out, leaving my father alone in the silence. Julian stared into the mirror, but he did not see a tycoon anymore. He saw a man who was already homeless. He just did not know it yet. He slumped against the cold marble wall and slid down to the floor, pulling at his hair as the reality of his ruin crashed down on him. Julian stormed out of the restroom, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. The elegant music of the string quartet now sounded like a funeral march. He scanned the crowded ballroom, his eyes wild and desperate. He needed to find Preston. He needed to hear that Winston Sterling was lying. He needed to believe that his $500,000 was safe in a crypto account in Tokyo and not vanished into the pockets of a bookie. He found his son-in-law near the open bar, but Preston did not look like a financial genius stressing over global markets. He looked like a frat boy at a keg party. Preston had his jacket off, his tie undone, and his arm draped around the waist of a young cocktail waitress who looked visibly uncomfortable. He was swaying slightly, holding a tumbler of scotch that was dangerously close to spilling. Julian marched up to him, grabbing his shoulder and spinning him around. "Preston." Julian gasped, out of breath. "Tell me it is a lie. Tell me Winston is wrong." Preston blinked, trying to focus his glossy eyes on my father. He let out a wet slur of a laugh. "Julian, my man," Preston shouted way too loud for the polite setting. "Relax. You look like you were having a stroke. Let me get you a drink." "Hey, sweetheart, bring my father-in-law a double." Julian slapped the drink out of Preston's hand. The glass shattered against the marble floor, sending amber liquid splashing onto the hem of a nearby woman's gown. The music stopped. The chatter died down. All eyes turned to the commotion. "Where is my money, Preston?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking. "Where is the mortgage money? Your father said you are a broke gambler. He said you have not had a trust fund in 5 years. Tell me he is lying." Preston's face changed instantly. The sloppy drunk mask fell away, revealing something much uglier. He shoved Julian backward hard enough that my father stumbled into a waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes. "My father is a bitter old man," Preston sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "And you are a gullible fool, Julian. You begged me to take that money. You practically threw it at me. Do not blame me because you were too stupid to read the room." "You stole from me," Julian cried, lunging forward, grabbing Preston by the lapels of his shirt. "I lost my house because of you." They grappled in the center of the room, a pathetic wrestling match between two men who had lost everything. Preston threw a clumsy punch that grazed Julian's cheek. A woman screamed. Suddenly, the sea of people parted. 4 large security guards materialized out of the crowd. They did not ask politely. 2 of them grabbed Preston, pinning his arms behind his back, while the other 2 restrained my father. "Get off me! Do you know who I am?" Preston screamed, spitting as he yelled. "I am a Sterling. I bought this hotel." "Sir, you are trespassing," the head of security said, his voice calm and final. "You need to leave the premises immediately, or we will call the police." They dragged them toward the exit. My father was crying now, begging the guards to listen, begging someone to help him. Preston was cursing, kicking at the air. It was a spectacle of absolute humiliation. High above on the VIP balcony, I watched the scene unfold. I stood in the shadows, holding a glass of vintage Pinot Noir. The mayor stood beside me, looking down with a frown. "Is that your family, Valerie?" he asked quietly. I took a sip of the wine, savoring the complex notes of dark cherry and victory. I looked down at the tiny figures being thrown out of the revolving doors into the cold night. "No, Mr. Mayor," I said softly, setting my glass on the railing. "That is just some bad investment I finally liquidated." I turned my back on the balcony and walked back into the warmth of the party, leaving them in the cold where they belonged. The morning of December 29th was unusually quiet inside the Wilson estate. It was the silence of a held breath. For 3 days, my father Julian had been pacing the hardwood floors, checking his phone every 30 seconds. He was waiting for the call from Preston. He was waiting to hear that the Project Phoenix deal had closed and that the $500,000 he had secretly borrowed against the house had miraculously turned into $1 million. But the phone never rang. Preston had gone radio silent. My mother Bernice was in the kitchen arranging flowers, trying to pretend that they hadn't been thrown out of the gala like common criminals. She hummed a hymn to soothe her nerves, oblivious to the fact that the roof over her head no longer belonged to her. She thought the worst thing that had happened was a little social embarrassment. She had no idea she was sleeping inside a ticking time bomb. Then came the sound that haunts every homeowner in financial ruin. It wasn't a doorbell. It was a heavy, authoritative pounding on the front door. Thud, thud, thud. Bernice wiped her hands on her apron. "I will get it," she called out cheerily. "It is probably the caterer apologizing for the mix-up." She walked to the foyer, her heels clicking on the marble. She opened the massive oak door with a practiced smile, ready to accept an apology. But there was no caterer. Standing on the porch was a deputy sheriff with a thick neck and eyes that had seen too many evictions to care about her feelings. In his hand, he held a staple gun and a sheet of paper. It was neon orange, the color of emergency, the color of shame. "Mrs. Wilson?" the deputy asked. "Yes," she answered, confused. "Foreclosure notice," the deputy said flatly. Before she could even protest, he slapped the orange paper against the dark wood of the door, right at eye level. Thwack! Thwack! The sound of the staples biting into the expensive wood echoed through the house like gunshots. Bernice stared at the paper. The words, printed in bold black letters, seemed to swim before her eyes. Notice of default. Immediate foreclosure proceedings. Auction date, January 1st. "Julian!" she screamed. It was a sound of pure primal terror. "Julian, come here!" My father ran into the hallway. When he saw the deputy walking back to his patrol car and the orange scar on his front door, his knees almost gave out. He grabbed the door frame to hold himself up. Bernice turned to him, her face pale as a ghost. "What is this, Julian? Why is the bank taking our house? We paid off the mortgage years ago. Valerie paid it off." Julian opened his mouth, but only a squeak came out. He looked at the floor, unable to meet his wife's eyes. He stammered. "I borrowed against it," Preston said. "He said he needed a bridge loan. He said he would pay it back double in 3 days." Bernice felt the room tilt. The walls seemed to close in on her. She looked at the husband she had trusted, the man she had allowed to bully their daughter, and she saw him for what he truly was, a weak, foolish man who had gambled their sanctuary on a lie. "You gave him the house," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You gave that con artist my house. It was an investment," Julian cried, tears streaming down his face. "He promised me Bernice. You fool!" she shrieked. The stress was too much. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The blood rushed from her head. Bernice Wilson, the woman who prided herself on her strength and her status, swayed on her feet. Her eyes rolled back, her legs folded beneath her. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor with a sickening thud, right where I had stood 3 days ago when she snatched the plate from my daughter. "Bernice!" Julian shouted, falling to his knees beside her, shaking her limp body. From the security camera feed on my laptop miles away, I watched my father cradle his unconscious wife in the foyer of a house they no longer owned. The game was over. The house of cards had fallen. And Preston was nowhere to be found. The foreclosure notice on the front door was still flapping in the cold wind, But inside the house, a much more dangerous storm was brewing. My mother, Bernice, was sitting up on the marble floor holding her head, still dazed from fainting. My sister Isolde stood over her, but she was not looking at our mother. She was looking at her husband. Preston stood by the fireplace. He was not the polished gentleman in the polo shirt anymore. He was unraveling. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a withdrawal of power and perhaps something chemical. Isolde walked up to him, her voice rising to that pitch she used when a waiter got her order wrong. "You told Daddy you doubled the money," she screamed, poking a manicured finger into his chest. "You said Project Phoenix was a sure thing. Why is the sheriff at our door, Preston? Did you lose it? Did you steal my inheritance?" Preston did not argue. He did not make up a lie about crypto markets or frozen accounts. He just snapped. The mask of the charming, sterling air fell away completely, revealing the desperate, cornered animal underneath. He swung his arm in a wide, violent arc. The sound of his open palm connecting with Isolde's cheek was louder than the foreclosure staple gun. It was a crack that shattered the last illusion of their perfect marriage. Isolde flew backward, crashing onto the sofa, clutching her face in absolute shock. The room went silent. Even my mother stopped moaning and stared at her golden son-in-law in horror. "You shut your mouth!" Preston roared, his voice unrecognizable. "Do not you dare question me! You think I wanted to deal with your pathetic little problems? I did you a favor marrying you." He kicked the heavy glass coffee table, sending a crystal vase crashing into the wall where it shattered into 1,000 pieces. "You people make me sick," he spat, pacing around the room like a caged tiger. "Walking around here in your fake designer clothes, acting like you own Atlanta. You are nothing but trash wrapped in tinfoil. I gave you a name. I gave you credibility. And what did you give me? A mortgage that barely covered my interest payments." Isolde began to sob, a low, terrified sound. "Why, Preston," she whimpered. "We loved you." "Love?" Preston laughed, a cruel, dark sound. "You loved my last name. You loved the country club access. You are parasites, all of you. You bleed me dry and then you complain when the well runs empty. Your father is a gullible idiot who practically begged me to take his money. And you..." He grabbed a framed wedding photo from the mantel. It was a picture of them cutting the cake, smiling and looking like the perfect couple. He looked at it with disgust and hurled it into the fireplace. The glass broke and the frame cracked. "You are useless without my money," Preston sneered. "You have no talent. You have no job. You are just a weight around my neck. And now, because your sister decided to play God, I am drowning." He walked over to the liquor cabinet and swept his arm across the shelf. Bottles of expensive scotch and brandy crashed to the floor, creating a pool of broken glass and alcohol fumes. "I am going out," Preston announced, stepping over the wreckage. "Do not wait up. And if either of you calls the police, I will tell them you attacked me. Who do you think they will believe? The sterling heir? Or the family getting evicted for not paying their bills?" He stormed out of the room, leaving his wife and mother-in-law huddled together in the ruins of their living room, surrounded by the shards of their broken dreams. For the first time, they realized that the monster was not the bank. It was the man they had invited to dinner. The concierge called up to my suite at 10 in the morning, his voice hushed and apologetic. He told me there was a woman in the lobby causing a disturbance claiming to be my mother. I told him to send her up. I did not do it out of kindness. I did it because I wanted her to see the view from the top before she hit rock bottom. When the elevator doors slid open, Bernice Wilson stepped out. She did not look like the grande dame of Buckhead anymore. Her signature Chanel suit was wrinkled as if she had slept in it. Her eyes, usually sharp and critical, were swollen shut from crying. She looked small. She looked defeated. "Valerie," she choked out, rushing toward me with her arms outstretched. "Oh, thank God! I knew you would not abandon us. I knew you were still my good girl." She tried to embrace me, to wrap me in the same arms that had pushed me away for 30 years. I took a step back, my movement sharp and precise. "Do not touch me," I said. Bernice froze. Her hands dropped to her sides. She looked around the penthouse, taking in the velvet furniture, the fresh orchids, the undeniable scent of wealth. Her chin quivered. "Valerie, please," she begged, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "The bank is taking the house." The sheriff put a notice on the door. "Your father made a terrible mistake. He listened to Preston. That man destroyed us, Valerie. He gambled everything. We have nowhere to go. You have to help us. You are the only one who can fix this." She fell to her knees on the plush carpet, clutching at the hem of my silk robe. "I am your mother," she sobbed. "I gave you life. I carried you inside me. You cannot let your own parents sleep on the street. It is winter, Valerie. Have mercy." I looked down at her. I waited for a flicker of sympathy to ignite in my chest. I searched for the love a daughter is supposed to feel. I found nothing, just a cold, empty space where my heart used to be. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city covered in snow. "Get up, Bernice," I said without turning around. "You are ruining the aesthetic of my living room." She scrambled to her feet, wiping her face. "So you will help us? You will pay off the loan?" I turned around slowly. "Do you remember Christmas Eve, Mother? It was only 5 days ago. Do you remember what you did when Mia reached for a piece of bread?" Bernice blinked, confused by the change of subject. "What? That was just stress, Valerie. The Sterlings were there. I was trying to make a good impression." "You snatched the plate out of a 7-year-old's hands," I said, my voice rising just enough to cut through her excuses. "You told us to go sit in the garage because we were not good enough to eat with your guests. You chose appearances over your own grandchild. You chose your precious reputation over my dignity." "I did what I thought was best for the family," Bernice cried, wringing her hands. "No," I corrected her. "You did what was best for your ego. You wanted to look rich so badly that you treated your actual blood like trash." "Well, congratulations, Mother. You got what you wanted. You are free of us." I walked to the door and held it open. "Valerie, please," she whispered. "We have nothing left. We have no money. We have no friends. All we have is our name." I smiled. It was a smile that did not reach my eyes. "Then I suggest you take that name down to the bank," I said. "Walk up to the teller and deposit all that pride you sacrificed us for. Deposit your precious reputation. See if your dignity covers the mortgage payment, because my checkbook is closed." "But where will we go?" she wailed. "I do not know," I said. "Maybe you should try the garage. I hear it has a heater." I closed the door in her face. I listened to her sobbing on the other side for a moment before the security guards gently escorted her away. I went back to the window. It was starting to snow again, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely warm. The living room of the Wilson estate felt like a tomb. The heat had been turned down to save money, and the air was thick with the chill of impending ruin. My father, Julian, sat in his leather armchair staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. He was a broken man, a shell of the patriarch who had barked orders at me just days ago. In the corner, my mother, Bernice, wept softly, clutching a rosary, but her prayers were not being answered. Preston paced back and forth in front of the fireplace, his shadow dancing wildly against the wall. He was manic. The desperation had stripped away his polished veneer, leaving behind something feral and dangerous. He needed a lifeline. He needed cash to pay off the shark circling his own debts before they broke his knees. Suddenly he stopped. His eyes widened with a dark, feverish inspiration. He spun around to face my father. "The trust fund, Preston," whispered, his voice raspy. Julian looked up, his eyes dull and lifeless. "What are you talking about?" "Your mother," Preston said, walking quickly to the chair. "Grandma Rose. She left a trust fund for Valerie. I saw the paperwork years ago when I was snooping through her files. It was set to mature when she turned 30. Julian shook his head slowly. "Valerie controls that. We cannot touch it." Preston knelt down beside my father, gripping the armrest of the chair until his knuckles turned white. "She has not touched it," Julian Preston hissed. "I checked the bank logs. It is sitting there, dormant. It has been accumulating interest for a decade. There must be at least $300,000 in there, maybe more. That is enough to stop the foreclosure. That is enough to save us." Julian blinked. 300,000? It was a number that sounded like salvation. But then reality set in. "It is in her name, Preston," Julian said, his voice weak. "We cannot access it." Preston smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression my father had ever seen. It was the smile of a man who had crossed the line of morality and was looking for company. "We do not need her permission," Preston said softly. "We just need her signature. And you know her signature, Julian. You taught her how to write. You have seen it on 1,000 report cards and the corporate seal, the physical stamp she uses for official documents. I bet she left it in her old office here. She left in such a hurry she probably forgot it." Julian pulled back, horrified. "You want me to forge my daughter's signature? That is a felony, Preston. That is prison time." Preston laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Prison?" he mocked. "You know what is a prison, Julian? Being homeless. Watching your wife sleep in a shelter because you were too scared to do what was necessary. And besides, is it really stealing? We raised her. We fed her. We clothed her. That money belongs to this family. She owes us a reimbursement. We are just taking what is rightfully ours." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a seductive whisper. "Just one check, Julian. We backdate it. We deposit it tonight via mobile app. By tomorrow morning, the house is saved. And Valerie is so rich, she will not even notice a few $100,000 missing. It is pocket change to her." Julian looked at Bernice, shivering in the corner. He looked at the luxury walls he was about to lose. The fear of poverty outweighed his conscience. He looked at Preston and slowly nodded. "Where is the seal?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. Preston stood up triumphantly. "Let us go to her old office," he said. "It is time to make a withdrawal." The wind on the night of December 29th cut through the parking lot of the desolate office park like a knife made of ice. My father. Julian pulled the collar of his coat up around his ears, his breath forming nervous clouds in the freezing air. He looked at the nondescript brick building in front of him. It was the old satellite office where I used to handle paperwork for my startups before I moved headquarters to the skyline. To Julian, it looked like just another empty building. To Preston, it looked like a treasure chest waiting to be cracked open. Preston walked ahead, his movements jerky and agitated. He held a heavy flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other, though he prayed he would not have to use it. He reached the rear service door and shone the light on the keypad. "Do you remember the code Julian Preston hissed over his shoulder? You visited her here once to borrow money for the country club dues. What was the code?" Julian wiped his sweating palms on his pants. He felt sick. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was not borrowing. This was not a gray area. This was breaking and entering. "I think it was her birthday," Julian whispered. "Or maybe Mia's birthday. Try 0712. Preston punched the numbers in. The buttons beeped loud in the silence. 1, 2, 3, 4. The light on the lock blinked red. Denied. "Damn it," Preston cursed, kicking the door. "Think, Julian. Think if you want to sleep in a bed next week." Julian closed his eyes, trying to channel the daughter he had ignored for so long. He remembered the day I opened this office. I had called him proud of my first lease. He had been too busy watching a football game to listen. "Try the day she graduated," Julian said softly. "The day we did not go to her ceremony." 0515. Preston rolled his eyes but typed the numbers. 0, 5, 1, 5. Click. The light turned green. The heavy lock disengaged with a mechanical groan that sounded like a jaw opening. "You are a genius," Preston grinned, pushing the door open. "See? She is predictable. She holds on to the past. That is her weakness." They stepped inside. The air in the office was stale and cold. Preston swept the flashlight beam across the room. It was mostly empty, just a few filing cabinets and a large oak desk in the corner, covered in a dust sheet. "Check the desk," Preston commanded. Julian walked toward the desk, his legs feeling like lead. He pulled the dust sheet away. The desk was clean, except for a single locked drawer. "It is locked," Julian said, relief washing over him. "We cannot get in. Let us go, Preston. This is a sign." Preston did not listen. He jammed the flat end of the crowbar into the gap above the drawer. With a grunt of exertion, he applied pressure. Wood splintered, metal screeched. With a loud pop, the drawer flew open. "Shine the light, Julian," Preston barked. Julian aimed the beam into the drawer, and there it was, sitting right on top, as if it had been left there specifically for them to find. A thick leather binder containing business checks, and next to it, the heavy brass corporate seal of the Mia Wilson Trust. Preston reached in and grabbed the binder. He opened it, flipping through the pages. "Blank checks," he whispered, his voice trembling with greed. "Signed by the trustee, but waiting for a recipient. She must have pre-signed these for vendors before she moved offices. It is a gold mine, Julian. It is literally a blank check to save our lives." He grabbed the brass seal, weighing it in his hand. "We have the authority now," Preston said, looking at my father with wild eyes. "We have the check. We have the seal. We are not thieves, Julian. We are just reallocating family assets." Julian looked at the stolen items. He knew he should run. He knew this was the end of his soul, but he thought of the foreclosure notice. He thought of the shame. He reached out and took the checkbook. "Let us get out of here," Julian whispered, "before the ghosts wake up." They turned and ran back into the night, clutching their loot, thinking they had pulled off the heist of the century. They did not notice the tiny red light of the motion sensor blinking in the corner. They did not know that the alarm was silent, and they certainly did not know that I had left those checks there 2 days ago, knowing exactly who would come looking for them. The control room was bathed in the cool blue glow of a dozen high-definition monitors. It was quiet here, a stark contrast to the chaotic desperation playing out on the screens in front of us. I sat with my legs crossed, holding a cup of herbal tea that was still steaming. Beside me, Sheriff Miller stood with his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes narrowed as he watched the two figures fumbling around in the dark office on screen 3. On the monitor, my father, Julian, looked like a ghost. The night vision camera turned his skin a sickly gray, and his eyes were wide, frantic white circles. He was holding the flashlight with a shaking hand, while Preston hunched over the desk like a vulture picking at a carcass. We watched Preston pry open the drawer. We watched the wood splinter. The audio feed picked up every sound, the grunt of exertion, the snap of the lock, the heavy breathing of two men who were about to throw their lives away. Sheriff Miller leaned forward, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt. "That is breaking and entering, Ms. Wilson. We have them on tape destroying property and trespassing. That is enough to book them right now. My boys are parked around the corner. We can have them in cuffs in 30 seconds. I reached out and placed my hand gently on the sheriff's forearm. It was a light touch, but it stopped him cold. "No, Sheriff. Not yet." Miller looked at me confused. "What are we waiting for? They have the checkbook. They are stealing from you. If you arrest them now, it is just burglary," I said, my voice soft and devoid of mercy. Maybe they get probation. Maybe my father pleads ignorance and says he lost his key. A good lawyer could spin this as a family misunderstanding. That is not justice, Sheriff. That is a nuisance. I pointed at the screen. "Look. Preston is handing him the pen. Watch his hand." On the screen, Julian hesitated. For a second, I thought he might stop. I thought he might remember the daughter he was robbing. I thought he might remember the values he claimed to teach me. But then he uncapped the pen. He pressed the tip to the paper. He began to write. He was not just signing a check. He was signing a confession. By putting ink to that paper, he was crossing the line from a desperate father to a felon. He was committing wire fraud and identity theft. He was forging a document to defraud a federally regulated trust. I watched the pixels on the screen as he finished the signature. I watched Preston hand him the heavy brass seal. I waited until I saw the downward motion of the stamp. Thud. The seal was set. The crime was complete. There was no going back now. They had walked into the cage and locked the door themselves. I took a sip of my tea and leaned back in the leather chair. A smile touched my lips. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a chess player who just watched their opponent walk into a mate in one. "Now, Sheriff," I said, setting my cup down on the console. "Now you can go get them. Make sure the sirens are loud. I want them to know exactly when their luck ran out." The crystal chandeliers in the grand ballroom of the Wilson estate blazed with a desperate, blinding intensity on New Year Eve. It was a light meant to banish the shadows of foreclosure and the cold reality of the orange notice that Julian had scraped off the front door only hours earlier. The house smelled of expensive lilies and denial. Julian and Preston had decided to throw the party of the century, not because they had something to celebrate, but because they needed to prove to the world, and perhaps to themselves, that they were still the kings of Atlanta. Julian moved through the crowd of 50 guests with the frantic, manic energy of a man who had just cheated the executioner. He wore his tuxedo like armor. In his pocket, his phone sat warm and silent. He had checked the banking app 10 minutes ago. The deposit of $350,000 showed as pending. To a desperate man, pending meant safe. He believed the lie Preston had fed him. He believed that the check they had stolen from my office was the magic key that had unlocked their salvation. "Drink up, everyone," Julian shouted, his voice booming a little too loud over the jazz band. "There is plenty more in the cellar. The Wilsons are not going anywhere. We are just getting started." He poured champagne with a shaking hand, spilling foam onto the polished floor. He laughed at jokes that were not funny, clapping Winston Sterling on the back. Winston, who had only come to watch the train wreck, recoiled slightly. But Julian did not notice. He was high on the adrenaline of his crime. In the corner near the piano, Preston held court. He looked smug. He had convinced himself that he was a tactical genius. He told a circle of admiring women that he had just closed a massive deal in Hong Kong. "It was a little touch and go for a moment," Preston bragged, swirling his scotch. "But you know what they say. Fortune favors the bold." "We had to move some assets around, but the portfolio is stronger than ever." He caught Julian's eye from across the room and winked. It was a conspiratorial signal, a shared secret between two thieves who thought they had gotten away with the heist. They raised their glasses to each other, toasting their own cleverness, oblivious to the fact that the pending status on the bank account was not a processing delay, but a trap. Sitting on the velvet settee, Isolde looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together wrong. She wore a high-necked dress to hide any marks on her throat, and her makeup was applied with surgical precision. Layers of thick concealer and color corrector plastered her left cheekbone, hiding the purple and yellow bruise where Preston had struck her 3 days ago. Her smile was painted on. Her eyes were dead. "Isolde, darling, you look lovely," a guest chirped, leaning in for a kiss on the cheek. Isolde flinched, pulling back sharply. "Oh, thank you," she stammered, touching her face protectively. "I am just a little tired. It has been such a busy holiday season." She looked at Preston across the room. She hated him. She feared him. But mostly, she was paralyzed by the lie they were all living. She knew they had stolen the money. She knew her father had committed a felony. But she sat there, sipping sparkling cider and nodding, pretending that the ice under their feet was not cracking with every second that ticked toward midnight. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime, 11:59. "Everyone grab a glass!" Julian yelled, his face flushed and sweating. "The countdown is starting. 10, 9, 8. Julian wrapped his arm around Bernice, who looked dazed and medicated. Preston walked over and gripped Isolde's shoulder, his fingers digging into her skin, a silent warning to keep smiling. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! The room erupted. Confetti cannons fired. Streamers fell like rain. Julian kissed his wife. Preston kissed his victim. They drank the stolen champagne and laughed, believing they had survived the storm. They had no idea that the sirens were already wailing in the distance, coming closer with every beat of their hearts. The jazz band was playing a frantic, upbeat rendition of Auld Lang Syne as the clock on the mantelpiece clicked past 11:30. The air inside the ballroom was hot and smelled of expensive perfume and nervous sweat. My father, Julian, was in the middle of a toast, holding his champagne glass high, his face flushed with the intoxicated relief of a man who believes he has gotten away with murder. He was laughing at a joke Winston Sterling had not made, his voice booming with a false bravado that echoed off the high ceilings. Then the world changed color. It started at the windows. The warm, golden glow of the chandeliers was suddenly sliced through by harsh, rhythmic strobes of light. Red, blue, red, blue. It washed over the guests, turning their faces into pale, grotesque masks. The jazz band faltered, the drummer missing a beat as he stared outside. The laughter died in throats. The conversation stopped, as if someone had cut the power cord to the room. From the driveway came a sound that was not the popping of corks or the cheer of celebration. It was a wall of noise. Sirens. Dozens of them, wailing in a chaotic disharmony that vibrated against the window panes. Julian lowered his glass, his hand trembling so hard the champagne spilled over his knuckles. He looked toward the front entrance. The massive iron gates, which were supposed to be locked tight to keep out the riffraff, were slowly swinging open. They moved with a terrifying obedience, as if bowing to a superior power. Through the opening came the convoy. It was a parade of judgment. But it was not the police who led the charge. At the front of the line, cutting through the night like a shark through dark water, was a vehicle that silenced the entire room. A Rolls-Royce Phantom. It was jet black, polished to a mirror shine reflecting the chaotic police lights dancing around it. The Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament caught the light, leading the way like a silver angel of death. Behind the Rolls-Royce came the cavalry. Cruiser after cruiser, SWAT vans with armored sides, unmarked sedans with lights flashing in the grilles. They poured into the circular driveway, their tires crunching aggressively on the gravel. They swarmed the lawn, blocking every exit surrounding the house in a ring of flashing steel. Preston stood by the piano, his face the color of ash. He dropped his scotch glass. It hit the floor, but nobody heard it shatter over the sound of the sirens outside. He knew that car. He knew who was sitting in the back seat behind the privacy glass. He had told Julian that I was defeated. He had said I was oblivious. Now he was staring at a $600,000 symbol of my absolute control. The convoy came to a halt. The sirens cut off simultaneously, leaving a ringing silence that was even louder than the noise had been. The engines hummed a low, menacing growl. My father took a step back, bumping into a waiter. He looked at the front door, the same door he had scraped the foreclosure notice off of hours ago. He looked at Preston. For the first time all night, the delusion shattered. The pending deposit was not coming. The crypto deal was a lie. The only thing that was real was the black car sitting in his driveway and the army of law enforcement standing behind it, waiting for the command to breach. Inside the Rolls-Royce, I watched them through the tinted glass. I saw the terror in the windows. I saw the party die. I adjusted the lapel of my coat and signaled to the driver. It was time to go in. The clock was ticking toward midnight, but for my family, time had just run out. The heavy double doors of the foyer did not just open, they yielded. I stepped across the threshold into the house where I had been raised, and the silence that greeted me was heavy enough to crush bones. I did not look at my father, who was shaking by the punch bowl, his face the color of old paper. I did not look at my sister, hiding her bruised face behind a champagne flute. I walked straight through the crowd, my heels clicking a sharp military rhythm on the floor. The police officers flanked me, but they did not touch me. They were my escort, not my captors. I stopped in front of the massive 80-inch television mounted above the fireplace. It was playing a loop of a burning Yule log, a fake fire to warm a fake family. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I did not speak. Words were unnecessary when you had high-definition resolution. I tapped the screen once, mirroring my device to the display. The fake fire vanished. In its place, a grainy black and white feed flickered to life. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The timestamp in the corner read December 29th. The location tag read Mia Wilson, Trust Satellite Office. On the screen, two figures stumbled into the frame. There was no mistaking the hunch of my father's shoulders or the frantic greed in Preston's movements. The audio was crystal clear, amplified by the surround sound speakers usually reserved for holiday music. The guests watched in horrified fascination as Preston pried the drawer open with a crowbar. They heard the wood snap. They heard my father ask if it was a felony. They heard Preston laugh and say, "It was just reimbursement." The camera zoomed in, digitally capturing the ink flowing from the pen as Julian forged my signature. It captured the heavy thud of the brass seal slamming down onto the check. The stolen money. The lie. It was all there, playing out in high definition for the mayor, the bankers, and the neighbors to see. I hit pause on the frame where they were holding the stolen checkbook high like a trophy. The image froze, illuminating the room in a harsh, accusing light. I finally turned around to face the room. The party was dead. Winston Sterling looked at Julian with a mixture of shock and absolute revulsion, moving away from him as if dishonesty was a contagious disease. My mother, Bernice, covered her mouth, stifling a scream, her eyes darting between the screen and her husband. Preston tried to speak. He opened his mouth to spin another web, to claim it was deep fake technology or a misunderstanding, but the words died in his throat. The evidence was not just a smoking gun. It was a nuclear bomb. I stood there, framed by the image of their crime, the light from the screen casting a long shadow over the people who had tried to bury me. I did not need to shout. I did not need to accuse. The silence of the room screamed the truth loud enough for everyone to hear. The verdict had been delivered, and the jury of their peers was staring at them with eyes full of judgment. The silence that followed the video was not peaceful. It was the vacuum before an explosion. The image of my father committing a felony was still frozen on the giant screen, looming over the party like a digital judge. Sheriff Miller stepped into the center of the room. He did not need a microphone. His voice carried the weight of the federal government, and it cut through the warm air of the ballroom like a blade of ice. "Preston Sterling," the sheriff announced, his hand resting on his holster. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and grand larceny. Julian Wilson, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit bank fraud and forgery." The words hung in the air. My father, Julian, let out a sound that was half sob and half gasp. He looked at the guests, his friends, his neighbors, the people he had spent a lifetime trying to impress. They were all staring at him with a mixture of pity and revulsion. He turned to Preston, his eyes wide with betrayal. "You said it was legal," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "You said it was a reimbursement. You told me we were just moving family assets." Preston did not look at him. Preston was looking for an exit. The arrogance that had defined him for years, the swagger he wore like a second skin, evaporated in an instant. He was no longer the master of the universe. He was a rat in a trap. He scanned the room, his eyes darting frantically from the uniformed officers at the front door to the heavy velvet drapes covering the French doors at the back of the room. "Grab them," the sheriff ordered. The deputies moved in. Two officers grabbed Julian by the arms. My father did not fight. He slumped between them, his legs giving out completely. The click of the handcuffs ratcheting tight around his wrists was a sharp, metallic sound that signaled the end of his life as he knew it. He wept openly, his head hanging low, the shame crushing him into the floor. But Preston was not going to go quietly. He saw a gap in the line of officers near the buffet table. Panic overrode logic. He lunged. He knocked over a tray of crystal glasses, sending them crashing to the floor in a shower of shards. He shoved a waiter aside, sprinting toward the back exit in a pathetic, desperate dash for freedom. He actually thought he could outrun the consequences of his actions. He made it 3 steps. A deputy who looked like he was carved out of granite stepped forward and dropped his shoulder. He did not tackle Preston gently. He hit him with the force of a freight train. Preston flew backward, his feet leaving the ground. He landed hard on the polished marble floor. The breath left his body in a wheezing grunt. The impact was visceral. It was the physical manifestation of his entire life collapsing. He scrambled, trying to get up, slipping on the spilled champagne and the broken glass. He looked up, and for a split second, our eyes met. He was on his hands and knees, gasping for air, his tuxedo torn, his nose bleeding. "Stay down," the deputy roared, pressing a knee into Preston's back. Preston cried out, his face pressed against the cold, hard floor. It was the exact same position he had forced my daughter into when he made us feel small. It was the same floor where he had stood tall and mocked the poor. Now he was eating the marble. I walked over slowly, my heels clicking on the stone. I stood over him, looking down at the man who had terrorized my family, who had beaten my sister and robbed my father. "You look comfortable down there, Preston," I said, my voice calm and cold. "Finally, you are at the level you belong." The deputy yanked Preston's arms behind his back. The handcuffs clicked. The party was over. The cleanup had begun. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Winston Sterling walked toward the center of the ballroom. He moved with the slow, deliberate weight of a battleship cutting through choppy water. He did not look at the police officers who stood with their hands on their holsters. He did not look at the stunned guests who were whispering behind their hands, their eyes wide with scandal. His gaze was locked on one thing and one thing only: his son. Preston lay on the marble floor, his cheek pressed against the cold stone, the handcuffs cutting into his wrists, his expensive tuxedo ruined by champagne and the filth of the floor. When Preston saw his father, a flicker of hope ignited in his eyes. It was a pathetic, desperate hope, the kind a child has when they wake up from a nightmare and call for their parents. He struggled against the deputy's grip, trying to lift his head. "Father," Preston choked out, his voice cracking with tears. "Dad, thank God. Tell them who we are. Make them stop. Call the governor. You can fix this. Just write a check. Please, Dad, get me out of here." Winston stopped 3 feet away. He looked down at his son. There was no love in his gaze. There was no anger. There was only the cold calculation of a man looking at a business asset that had become a toxic liability. Beside him, Eleanor Sterling clutched her pearl necklace, her face pale and trembling, but she remained silent. She stood in her husband's shadow, just as she always had, terrified to step into the light. Preston waited for the hand to reach down. He waited for the rescue. Instead, Winston adjusted his cufflinks, checking the shine of the gold in the ballroom light. "I do not know who you are," Winston said, his voice flat and loud enough for everyone to hear. Preston blinked, confused by the rejection. Dad, it is me. It is Preston, your son. The Sterling family name represents integrity, success, and power, Winston continued, speaking to the room more than to his son. We do not associate with common criminals. We do not associate with thieves who have to steal from their in-laws to pay their gambling debts. You have disgraced this lineage for the last time. But I am your son, Preston screamed, pulling at the cuffs until his skin broke. You are a bad investment, Winston said coldly, his face like a stone mask. And I am liquidating my position. You are on your own, Preston. Do not call the house. The number has been changed. Do not write to us. The letters will be burned. As far as I am concerned, I have no son. Winston turned to the sheriff and nodded once, a gesture of permission to take out the trash. Then he turned on his heel. He placed a hand on Eleanor's back, guiding her away. Eleanor looked back for 1 second, a single tear rolling down her cheek, but she did not stop. She followed the money, just like she always did. Dad, wait! Preston howled, his voice breaking into a raw, animal sound of abandonment. Mom, do not leave me, please! Winston did not break stride. He walked straight past me. He paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes meeting mine. He gave a barely perceptible nod, acknowledging the checkmate. Then he walked out of the double doors, leaving his son bleeding on the floor, screaming for a family that no longer existed. The silence he left behind was heavier than the handcuffs. Preston had lost his money, his freedom, and his wife. But in that moment, watching his father walk away without looking back, he lost the only thing that really mattered to him: his name. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck the final note of the year. Dong. Midnight. But there was no kiss. There was no clinking of champagne glasses. Instead, the first second of the new year was marked by the harsh mechanical slam of a police cruiser door closing on my father is weeping face. Julian Wilson. The man who thought he could steal his way to salvation watched the fireworks explode over the city through the metal mesh of a prisoner transport van. The sky lit up with brilliant bursts of red and gold, a celebration for the rest of the world, but a mocking farewell to his life of privilege. Inside the house, the party was over. The guests had fled, scrambling into their cars to escape the scandal, leaving behind half-empty glasses and the smell of fear. But for my mother, Bernice, and my sister Isolde, the nightmare was just beginning. The sheriff stood by the front door holding a heavy roll of yellow tape and a padlock that looked like a fist. You need to vacate the premises immediately, the officer said, his voice devoid of sympathy. This property is now under the control of the bank and the Federal Evidence Unit. You cannot stay here. You cannot pack a bag. You have to leave. Now. But where will we go? Bernice wailed, clutching her chest. It is freezing outside. We have no coats. We have no car. That is not my problem, Ma, the officer said, ushering them toward the threshold. You should have thought about that before your husband forged a federal document. Out! He pushed them gently but firmly out of the warmth of the foyer and into the biting winter wind. Bernice stumbled in her heels, clutching Isolde for support. Isolde was shivering violently, her thin silk dress offering no protection against the snow that was starting to fall again. Behind them came the sound that would haunt them forever. Bam! The massive oak door, the symbol of their status, the barrier they had used to keep the world out, slammed shut. Then came the scratching sound of the official seal being plastered across the wood. Sealed. Do not enter." They stood there on the front porch, shivering in the dark. The security lights clicked off, leaving them in the shadows. They walked slowly down the long, winding driveway, the snow crunching under their expensive, useless shoes. They reached the curb and stopped. Bernice looked around, bewildered. She looked at the closed gates. She looked at the dark windows of the mansion that was no longer hers. And then she looked down at her feet. "We are here," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "We are right here." They were standing in the slush on the side of the road. It was the exact same spot where they had forced me to park my Honda 5 days ago. It was the exact same spot where they had watched me buckle my daughter into a cold car and told me I was not good enough to eat their food. The universe had come full circle. They were standing in the footprint of their own cruelty. Isolde looked up at the sky. A final firework bloomed, a massive white chrysanthemum of light that illuminated her bruised face and her ruined makeup. She started to laugh, a high-pitched, broken sound that sounded like glass breaking. "Happy New Year, Mommy," Isolde whispered, her voice cracking. Bernice did not answer. She just stood there in the cold, staring at the closed gates, realizing that the family she had tried so hard to protect was gone, and the daughter she had thrown away was the only one who was warm tonight. The cold wind howled around them, and for the first time in their lives, there was no one coming to let them back in. The courthouse smelled of lemon floor polish and stale anxiety, a scent that sticks to the back of your throat long after you leave. It had been 30 days since the sirens lit up the winter sky at the Wilson estate. 30 days of depositions and evidence review that stripped away every layer of my family as pretense. Today was the final act. I sat in the back row, wearing a black trench coat, not hiding, but observing. The gallery was mostly empty. The fair-weather friends who had crowded the ballroom for the New Year Eve party were nowhere to be found. The Sterlings were notably absent. Preston sat alone at the defense table, and for the first time in his life, he looked exactly as small as he truly was. He was not wearing a tuxedo today. He was wearing a jumpsuit the color of a traffic cone, a harsh, bright orange that washed out his pale skin. His hair, usually gelled and styled, was limp and greasy. He kept turning around, looking at the heavy wooden doors, praying for his father to walk in with a high-powered lawyer to save him. But the doors remained closed. Winston Sterling meant what he said. He had liquidated his bad investment. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge, and we all stood. Judge Harrison was a stern woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose. She shuffled the papers on her bench, the rustling sound echoing in the silence. She looked down at Preston over the rim of her spectacles. "Preston Sterling," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You have been found guilty of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and grand larceny. You preyed on your own family. You manipulated a desperate man into committing a crime to cover your own gambling debts. The court finds no remorse in your actions, only regret that you were caught." Preston began to shake his chains, rattling against the table. "I sentence you to 10 years in a federal penitentiary," the judge announced. "No possibility of parole for the first 5 years." The gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Preston put his head in his hands and sobbed, a raw, ugly sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He was not crying for the pain he caused. He was crying because he knew he would not survive a week in a place where his last name meant nothing. Then it was my father's turn. Julian Wilson stood up. He looked 20 years older than he had a month ago. His suit was too big for him, hanging off his shrunken frame. He gripped the table to keep from falling over. "Julian Wilson," the judge said, her tone shifting from anger to pity. "You were a foolish man, led astray by greed and pride. You betrayed your daughter and forged a federal document. However, the court recognizes that you were manipulated by a predator." My father looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "I am sentencing you to 5 years of probation," the judge ruled. "You will not go to prison today." Julian let out a breath, a sob of relief. But the judge was not finished. "However," she continued, "you must make full restitution to the Mia Wilson Trust. The court is seizing your pension, your 401k, and all remaining personal assets to repay the stolen funds and the legal fees. You are avoiding a cell, Mr. Wilson, but you are leaving this courtroom with nothing but the clothes on your back. You are bankrupt in finance and in reputation." The gavel struck again. Final, irreversible. The bailiff moved in to take Preston away. As they dragged him out the side door, he looked back at me one last time. There was no arrogance left, just fear. My father walked out the back of the courtroom, a free man by law, but a prisoner of his own shame. He walked slowly, his head down, unable to look me in the eye. I watched them both disappear. The scales of justice had balanced. I buttoned my coat and walked out into the sunlight. The air outside was cold, but for the first time in forever, it felt clean. The beige polyester uniform scratched Isolde's skin, a constant, irritating reminder of how far she had fallen. She pushed the heavy housekeeping cart down the long, carpeted hallway of the St. Regis, the wheels squeaking a rhythm of misery. Her manicured nails were gone, replaced by short, jagged edges and hands that smelled permanently of bleach and toilet bowl cleaner. She kept her head down, hoping the brim of her cap would hide her face from the guests she used to party with. Suddenly, a pair of familiar black stilettos stopped right in front of her cart. Isolde froze. She knew those shoes. She knew the power in that stance. She slowly lifted her eyes. Valerie stood there, looking immaculate in a tailored business suit, holding a file folder. There was no anger in Valerie's eyes, only a cool, distant recognition, like one might look at a stranger. Isolde felt the old urge to scream, to insult, to demand her sister fix this. But then she remembered the eviction. She remembered the hunger. She remembered that this job was the only thing keeping her off the street. Isolde swallowed the bile in her throat. She stepped to the side and lowered her head, staring at the floor. "Good afternoon, madame," she whispered, her voice trembling. Valerie did not say a word. She simply nodded and walked past, leaving Isolde alone in the hallway with nothing but her cart and the crushing weight of her own karma. The peeling paint on the ceiling of the subsidized apartment was a stark contrast to the hand-painted murals Bernice used to admire in her foyer. She sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket that smelled of mothballs. The room was cold, and the radiator hissed and clanked like a dying animal, but it was the only home she had left. On the wobbly bedside table sat a single framed photograph of the family from happier times, back when they lived in a world of illusion. Bernice picked it up, tracing the faces with a trembling finger, realizing too late that she had traded real love for a fake reputation. She reached for her cheap prepaid phone and opened the message chain with Valerie. It was a long scroll of blue bubbles with no gray responses on the other side. It was a diary of unread apologies. "I am so sorry, Valerie," she typed, her thumbs clumsy with arthritis and grief. "Please, just let me hear your voice. I miss you." She hit send and held her breath, staring at the screen, waiting for the phone to buzz, waiting for a sign of forgiveness or even anger. But the screen remained dark. The silence that filled the tiny room was heavier than the poverty. It was the absolute, terrifying silence of a bridge that had been burned to ashes, and she was left standing on the wrong side of the river. The snow fell softly on the iron gates of the Wilson estate, but this year they were wide open. There were no police cars and no foreclosure notices. There was only a new sign hanging above the entrance, painted in warm, inviting gold letters that read, "Mia is Haven." Valerie stood in the driveway looking up at the mansion that had once been a prison of expectations. She had bought the deed back from the bank not to reclaim her past, but to rewrite the future. She did not move into the master suite. Instead, she filled the rooms with cribs and warm blankets. Through the large bay window, she could see the dining room. It was no longer a place where grandfathers rejected their kin. It was filled with young mothers holding their babies, women who had been cast out by their own families, just as she had been. They were eating a hot meal in safety. Valerie wrapped her coat tighter and smiled. She had turned the site of her greatest humiliation into a sanctuary. The house was finally serving a higher purpose. It was no longer a monument to vanity. It was a home. The ceremony was over, and the media had gone, leaving only the soft glow of the porch lights reflecting on the snow. I stood at the top of the stairs, watching the women inside the foyer laughing and sharing stories. It was the sound of a home healing itself. Then I saw movement at the edge of the driveway. Standing outside the iron gates was a solitary figure, wrapped in a thin gray coat. It was Bernice. She was clutching the bars, looking in at the warmth she could no longer touch. Her face was a map of regret and longing. For a moment, the wind seemed to stop. We locked eyes across the expanse of the snowy lawn. I waited for the anger to rise, but it did not come. There was only a quiet, hollow pity. I did not wave. I did not invite her in. Instead, I offered her a single, slow nod. It was an acknowledgement of our shared history and a silent release of the pain. It was forgiveness, but it was not an invitation. Bernice understood, and her shoulders slumped in defeat. I turned my back on the ghost of my past and walked through the front door, closing it softly behind me, leaving the cold outside where it belonged. The fire in the hearth burned with a steady, comforting crackle, casting a soft orange glow across the room. It was not the suffocating heat of the Wilson estate, where every flame felt like it was burning up money. This was a warmth that reached all the way to the bone. My daughter Mia sat on the thick rug in the center of the room, building a tower of colorful blocks. She was laughing. It was a loud, uninhibited sound. She was not afraid of making a mess. She was not afraid of being too loud. She was just a child being a child, safe in a home where she was the priority. Sitting on the floor next to her was Daniel. He was stacking the blocks with the steady hands of a pediatric surgeon. He was a man who spent his days saving lives, not destroying them with gambling debts and ego. He was not wearing a tuxedo to impress anyone. He was wearing a worn, knitted sweater, and he looked up at me with a smile that was completely honest. He did not want my trust fund. He did not care about my last name. He just loved us. I curled up on the velvet sofa watching them. Outside the large bay window, the snow was falling gently, covering the world in a blanket of white. It looked beautiful, now, not threatening. The storm that had raged in my life for so long had finally broken. For 30 years, I had convinced myself that I was the problem. I thought I was broken because the people who were supposed to love me treated me like a burden. I thought I had to buy their affection with silence and obedience and money. I thought that blood was a binding contract that I could never escape, no matter how much it hurt. I took a deep breath, letting the scent of pine and cinnamon fill my lungs. I used to cry over what I had lost. I used to beg the universe to make them love me. But looking at Daniel helping Mia rebuild her castle, I finally understood the truth. Family is not about DNA. It is not about sharing the same genetics, or the same nose, or the same history. Family are the people who stand beside you when the hurricane hits. They are the ones who hold the umbrella over your head, not the ones who push you out into the rain and lock the door behind you. Family are the ones who celebrate your victories without jealousy and mourn your losses without judgment. I looked at the empty space where my old life used to be. I lost a mansion. I lost a prestigious reputation. I lost the parents who gave me life and the sister I grew up with. But in exchange, I found the people who give me a reason to live. I found my voice. I found my dignity. And most of all, I found myself. Some people might say I paid a high price for my freedom. But as I watched my daughter laugh, safe and loved, I knew the truth. It was the best deal I ever made. It was an absolute bargain. Valerie's story teaches us that true family is defined by loyalty, not DNA. We often endure toxicity to keep the peace, but we must learn that some bridges are meant to be burned to light our way forward. Breaking free was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of necessary self-preservation. She proved that your dignity is not a negotiation, and you never have to apologize for outgrowing people who insist on keeping you small. Real wealth is not a penthouse. It is the peace of knowing you are loved for who you are, not what you provide. If you are holding on to a relationship that drains you simply because of history, let this be your sign to choose your future over their comfort.